Have you ever stood at the edge of something you wanted, a promotion, a business, a relationship, a version of yourself, and felt a wall you couldn't explain? Not a wall made of money or time or circumstance, a wall made of something quieter, something inside you that said this far and no further. Maybe you've watched people with less talent, less preparation, less reason to succeed step right through that wall like it wasn't there, while you stood on your side of it, confused and quietly furious. Maybe you've started the same thing 3 times and stopped at the same point every time, and you've started to wonder if the stopping point is the real you. Maybe you've achieved things, real things, and still the wall appears slightly further ahead, always just out of reach. Have you ever wondered if the limit isn't out there in the world, but in the one thought you keep thinking about yourself without realizing it? If you've ever felt like your own mind was the last obstacle standing between you and the life you were built for, this story is for you. Because once there was a man who carried a single hidden thought for 30 years and let it quietly decide the ceiling of his entire life, until one morning on an empty athletics track showed him how to think differently forever. Stay with me until the end. In a sprawling port city where ambition was common and follow-through was rare, there lived a 32-year-old logistics manager named Nelson. Nelson was the son of a Jamaican dock worker who had arrived in the country with a second-hand suitcase and a conviction that hard work was the language every door understood. Nelson had inherited that conviction completely. He worked with precision, showed up early, stayed late, and took on problems other people avoided. Nelson believed one thing so deeply that he had never once questioned it. That potential was fixed at birth, and his job was to maximize what he had been given, nothing more. "I'm not the smartest person in the room," he would say, with what seemed like humility but was actually a ceiling. "I just work harder than everyone else." He meant it as a compliment to himself. What it was, without him knowing, was a lid. Every time Nelson approached a level of success that felt beyond what a dock worker's son from his neighborhood was supposed to reach, something in him quietly applied the brakes. He would undercut his own bid, withdraw from a conversation that was going well, talk himself out of an opportunity in the language of realism. He called it being grounded, his body called it safe, his life called it stuck. He was 32 years old, capable of far more than he was doing, and had never once asked himself why he kept stopping at the same invisible line. In the same company worked a man named Parle. Parle had joined 3 years after Nelson, with less experience and a degree from a university nobody had heard of. He was not more technically skilled than Nelson. He made more mistakes in his first year than Nelson had made in 5. He was, by any measurable early indicator, the less promising of the two, but Parle did something Nelson never did. When a regional director role opened up 2 pay grades above him, Parle applied. Everyone, including Nelson, assumed it was a joke. Parle did not get the role. He got the interview. 3 months later, a different senior position opened, and the same director who had interviewed Parle called him directly. Within 18 months of that first application, Parle was Nelson's peer in seniority. Within 24 months, he was Nelson's senior. Nelson watched this and told himself the story he always told. Parle was just confident. Confidence was something you either had or you didn't. Nelson didn't have it, so there was no point pretending otherwise. He went back to working hard. He went back to the lid. The moment came not in a boardroom but in a car park at 7:14 on a Wednesday evening. Nelson had just come out of a meeting where the operations director had asked in front of 12 people, who in the room felt ready to lead the new regional expansion project, the biggest initiative the company had attempted in a decade. 8 hands went up. Nelson's did not move. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his jaw tight and watched a colleague 2 years his junior volunteer for the role he had spent 3 years quietly preparing for. He sat in his car in the dark car park for 22 minutes before he could start the engine, not because he was angry. Because something had finally become too loud to ignore. A voice that had been whispering his whole life had in that silent car started to shout, "You did it again. You were the most prepared person in that room and you did not raise your hand, and it was not because you weren't ready. It was because some part of you does not believe you are allowed." He gripped the steering wheel and said out loud, alone in the dark, "What am I so afraid of?" It was the first honest question he had asked himself in 32 years. Nelson had a cousin named Radolf, older by 12 years, former semi-professional sprinter, now a track coach at a community athletics club. Radolf was the person in Nelson's family whom everyone respected but nobody fully understood. He said very little. When he did speak, it landed differently than other people's words. Nelson had not called Radolf in over a year. They had drifted the way busy people drift, not through argument but through the slow accumulation of unreturned calls and rescheduled visits. Calling now felt like an admission. It was. He called on a Thursday morning from the office car park before going inside. When Radolf picked up, Nelson did not make small talk. He said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. I think there's something wrong with the way I think about myself, and I don't know how to see it clearly on my own." There was a pause, then Radolf said, "Come to the track on Saturday morning, 6 o'clock, bring your running shoes." Nelson almost said he didn't run, he didn't say it. He said, "I'll be there." The athletics track was empty at 6 on a Saturday except for Radolf, who was crouched at the starting blocks with a stopwatch in his hand. He waved Nelson over without looking up. "Get in the blocks," he said. "I'm not a sprinter," Nelson said. "I know, get in the blocks." Nelson lowered himself awkwardly into the starting position. Radolf knelt beside him and placed one hand lightly on Nelson's shoulder. "Before I say go," Radolf said quietly, "I want you to notice what you're thinking right now." He waited. "What is it?" Nelson thought about it, then said, "That I'm going to look stupid." "There it is," Radolf said. He stood up. "That thought right there is the only thing between you and the starting blocks of every opportunity you've ever walked past." He held up the stopwatch. "That thought fires before you do, every single time." He clicked it once. "Now, here are 3 things I want you to understand. Law 1. The limit is the thought, not the truth. The thought that fires before you act, "I'm not the right person, I'm not ready, people like me don't do things like this," is not a fact about you. It is a recording. It was made early in circumstances that no longer exist by a younger version of you who needed to stay safe. That recording has been playing on a loop ever since, and because you've heard it so many times, you've mistaken it for reality. Here is what you must understand: a limit that lives only in a thought can be broken by a different thought. Not a louder thought, not a more positive thought, a more accurate one. The question to ask every time the recording plays is not, "Is this true?" It is this still true? Most of the time the honest answer is no. Law 2. Act before the thought finishes speaking. The thought that limits you is fast, but it is not instant. There is a gap, sometimes only 2 or 3 seconds, between the moment an opportunity appears and the moment the old recording tells you to stand down. That gap is where your life is decided. Sprinters know this. The difference between a great start and a false start is not strength. It is the willingness to move in the gap before the body tightens. Your practice starting this week is to identify one moment each day where the limiting thought fires and to take one visible action before it finishes. Not a big action, the raised hand, the sent email, the spoken sentence. Move in the gap, do it enough times and the gap widens, the recording gets quieter, the action becomes the new default. Law 3. The people watching you are waiting for permission. Here's what nobody tells you about breaking a limit. You're never breaking it only for yourself. Every person in your life who shares your background, your neighborhood, your family name, your quiet sense of not quite belonging, they are watching what you do with the opportunities you have. Not because they will judge you if you fail. Because they are using you to measure what is possible for them. When you lower your hand in a room where you belong, someone younger than you draws a line in the same place and calls it their ceiling. When you raise it imperfectly, nervously, without certainty, you do not just change your life. You change the question everyone around you is allowed to ask about their own. The limit was never only yours, neither is the breaking of it. Radolf held up the stopwatch one more time. "Get back in the blocks," he said. Nelson got down, the cold track pressed against his fingertips. "What are you thinking?" Radolf asked. Nelson was quiet for a moment, then, "That I'm going to run." "Good," Radolf said, and fired the stopwatch. On Monday morning, Nelson arrived at the office 19 minutes before the first meeting. He opened his email, found the message about the regional expansion project, and sent a 3-paragraph reply to the operations director explaining why he believed he was the right person to lead it and what he would do differently from the existing proposals on the table. He did not reread it 17 times. He sent it inside 4 minutes of writing it. The director replied within the hour. They met the following day. Nelson did not get the project lead role immediately. He was appointed deputy lead, working alongside the colleague who had raised his hand in the room. 6 weeks in, that colleague was reassigned to a client emergency. Nelson stepped up. Over the following 4 months, he reduced the project's implementation timeline by 22%, negotiated a logistics contract that saved the company $340,000 in the first year, and built a team of 7 people who, by the project's end, had all received internal commendations. He was promoted to Regional Operations Director 11 months after the night he sat in the dark car park asking himself the first honest question of his life. But the change that mattered most happened at a family dinner 6 months into the project. His father, quiet, careful, not a man who offered praise easily, watched Nelson explain the expansion work to the table, watched his son hold the room without apology, and said nothing until the end of the night. Then at the door he put one hand on Nelson's shoulder and said, "You sound like someone who knows he belongs there." Nelson called Radolf the next morning. "Something my father said last night," he started. "I know," Radolf said. "How were the blocks?" Nelson laughed, wide open. "My friend, Nelson's story is not about logistics or promotions or the corporate ladder. It is about the one thought, the recording that plays before every opportunity, that has been quietly deciding the size of your life without your permission. Every person watching this right now has a version of that thought. It sounds different for each of us, but it fires the same way, and it can be broken the same way. Remember three things. First, the next time you feel the limit, ask yourself one question: is this still true? Not was it ever true, not is it painful, is it still true right now about who you actually are today? Most of the time, the honest answer will surprise you. Second, find the gap. Today, identify one moment where the old recording fires and take one visible action before it finishes speaking. The raised hand, the sent message, the spoken word, one action in the gap. Do that every day this week, just once a day, and notice what changes by Friday. Third, remember who is watching. Someone in your life is using you as evidence of what is possible, not in a pressured way, in a quiet, hopeful way. When you move through the limit, you do not just change your story. You change the question they are allowed to ask about theirs. Your challenge, before this week ends, find the one opportunity you have been standing at the edge of, the email you haven't sent, the hand you haven't raised, the conversation you've been postponing, and take one action toward it. Not the whole thing, the first step. Inside the gap before the recording finishes. Because here is what Nelson learned and what I want you to carry with you. The limit was never made of stone, it was made of a thought. And a thought, unlike a wall, can be changed in a single moment, the moment you decide to think a more accurate one. If this story named the thought you've been living inside, share it with someone who needs to hear that the ceiling they're bumping against is not the sky. Drop a comment and tell me, what is the one thought that has been quietly deciding your limits, and what is the more accurate thought you are choosing instead? I read every one. I will be back next week with another story. Until then, get in the blocks. The gap is yours.